An old man sits in the dust of Hebron, holding a torn, blood-soaked tunic in his hands to hide him there. Same destination, same dark inevitability. Most people read the Old Testament and assume the ancient Israelites. Fades into a gray, featureless mist. The dead do not praise. They do not fight. They do not celebrate. They simply exist as Rephaim, a Hebrew word meaning ghosts. Shadows. The weak ones. It is a sensory deprivation tank for the human soul. Sheol is not an active torture chamber of burning sulfur. It is the suffocating horror of eternal fading. It is existence without life. It is presence without connection. It is the absolute terror of being cut off from the Dagdash, land of the living, and, most devastatingly, cut off from the hand of Yahweh. This is the dread that made righteous kings weep, because in the ancient Hebrew framework, this shadow swallowed everyone. It did not matter how much wealth you hoarded. It did not matter how many battles you won. When the breath left your lungs, the darkness claimed you exactly the same. But this suffocating silence was about to be weaponized by another ancient writer. A writer who looked at this dark, leveling reality and used it to expose the ultimate vanity of the human condition. We spend our lives trying to separate ourselves from the pack. A king builds a fortress. A general wins a war, viewed the afterlife exactly the way we do. We assume they pictured a golden heaven above for the good and a burning hell below for the wicked. A merchant hoards his silver. A scholar writes a scroll. We hustle. We sweat. We bleed. We try to carve our names into the heavy stone of history. We want to be remembered. We want to prove that our breath meant something. The author of Ecclesiastes looked at all this frantic human movement. He smelled the expensive myrrh of the royal court. He felt the coarse dirt on the slave's tunic. He watched the righteous man pray. He watched the wicked man lie. And he realized it all ends at the exact same door. The wise man dies. The fool dies. The man who sacrifices a spotless lamb dies. The man who never sets foot in the temple dies. They all go down into the dark. The exact same silence swallows them both. Ecclesiastes chapter 9 strips away every illusion of human grandeur. The author writes the most sobering command in ancient wisdom literature. Whatever your hand finds to do it with your might. Why? Because of what waits below the surface. For there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, to which you are going. Notice the absolute certainty in the text, to which you are going. There is no VIP section in the underworld. There is no illuminated waiting room for the righteous. You cannot bribe the darkness with heavy silver coins. You cannot fight off the shadows with a sharpened bronze sword. We open our English Bibles, see words like hell or the pit, and we instantly project centuries of medieval artwork. You cannot pull out your resume and argue your case before a judge. When the lungs stop pulling in air, the hierarchy collapses. The crown and the chains turn into the exact same ash. Sheol is not a ledger of your moral performance. It is the absolute erasure of human hierarchy. This was the terrifying consensus of the ancient Near East. It was the ultimate equalizer. The grave was a locked door from the inside, a one-way trip into the land of forgetfulness. It was the place where even God's presence seemed to stop. But scattered throughout the Hebrew poetry, a different pulse begins to beat. A faint, impossible idea starts to leak through the cracks of the text. An idea that maybe the door is not permanently locked. An idea that maybe the presence of Yahweh does not actually bounce off the gates of the underworld. Because if God is truly sovereign over the cosmos, someone is eventually going to have to intrude on the deep. The water is freezing. Salt burns his eyes. Thick seaweed wraps tightly around his head, pulling him down. The prophet Jonah is drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, swallowed by the crushing weight of a great fish. But as he sinks into the absolute pitch black of the deep, he does not just describe a physical drowning, Dante's Inferno, and Greek mythology, right onto the Hebrew text. But if you look closer at the ground beneath Jacob's feet, he describes a cosmic descent. He feels the very roots of the mountains looming over him, He feels the bars of the earth closing behind him like the heavy iron gates of a prison. And in Jonah chapter 2, verse 2, he names his exact location. "Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice." Jonah is still breathing, but poetically, he is already a ghost. He is at the absolute bottom of human existence. He is in the realm of the dead, but a crack suddenly appears in the ancient theology. Because from the suffocating, crushing dark of the abyss, the prophet speaks, and Yahweh listens. The darkness was supposed to be deaf. The depths were supposed to be silent. The grave was supposed to be the one place where the presence of the Creator completely stopped. But the silence of the underworld is pierced by a human prayer. The locked door of the deep rattles on its ancient hinges. The boundary that every pagan civilization believed was absolute has just been breached, decades later. A shepherd turned king sits under a vast, star-filled Judean sky and puts this terrifying, beautiful realization onto parchment. David writes Psalm 139, the ultimate poem of divine pursuit. He realizes that you can run to the edges of the sea. At the language these ancient authors were actually breathing, you start to see a reality that is far more unsettling. You can hide in the thickest shadows. You can climb into the heavens. But then, he looks down at the dirt, and he writes the impossible. "If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there." The implications are staggering. God is not afraid of the dark. God is not restricted to the temple courtyard. God is not bound by the physical fading of human breath. Sheol is not a boundary line the Creator cannot cross. It is a territory he intends to invade. This is the quiet pulse beating beneath the surface of the Old Testament. It is a whisper that the grave is not the final word. It is a hint that the God who breathed life into dust can reach his hand into the abyss and pull his people back out. It is the theological bedrock that sets the stage for a rolled-away stone on a Sunday morning in a garden outside Jerusalem. But seeing this ancient Hebrew hope is only half the battle, because the modern church does not read the Bible with an ancient Hebrew mind. We read it through a theological lens that was manufactured centuries later, and that lens is fundamentally blinding us to what the text actually says. We are infected with a Greek virus. It is an intellectual virus, born on the cold white marble of Athenian amphitheaters, then a pitchfork and a lake of fire. Sheol is not a torture chamber designed for the wicked, and it has completely hijacked how the modern Western world reads the Bible. The philosopher Plato taught that the physical body is a prison. He argued that the flesh is dirty, temporary, and flawed, while the immaterial soul is pure and immortal. In the Greek mind, death is a promotion. When the lungs stop pulling in air, the meat sack falls away, and the immortal spark finally floats up to the ethereal realm where it belongs. Most of us carry this exact framework in our heads. We look at a corpse in a wooden casket, smell the heavy scent of funeral lilies, and say, "They are not here, they are in a better place." We view the physical world as a temporary waiting room until we can finally shed our skin and exist as pure consciousness in the clouds. But the ancient Hebrew mind would look at that idea and recoil in horror. In the opening pages of Genesis, God does not trap a pre-existing soul inside a fleshy cage. He bends down into the damp soil of the Levant, scoops up a handful of red clay, and breathes his own spirit into the dirt. The text says, "The man became a living soul." You do not possess a soul. You are a soul. You are an animated pile of dirt, held together by the breath of Yahweh. The physical body is not a punishment to be escaped. It is the masterpiece of divine design. You can feel the dirt under your fingernails. It is the final, silent destination of everyone. And understanding what this place actually meant to the Hebrew mind, the heat of the sun on your neck, the sharp inhale of air filling your lungs, all of this is exactly what God called very good, which is why death, to the ancient Israelite, is an absolute catastrophe. When we project Greek dualism onto the Hebrew text, we completely miss the central tension of the biblical narrative. We wonder why David is not writing psalms about walking on streets of gold. We wonder why Job is not comforted by the thought of a celestial choir. They are not looking up at the clouds, because they understand that a human being without a physical body is a fractured, incomplete thing. Death is not the freeing of an immortal spark. It is the tragic unwinding of creation. When the breath returns to God, the human being ceases to function. You go down to Sheol, the silent abyss, where the body decays and the vibrant presence of life fades into a gray shadow. The Hebrew writers did not lack a theology of the afterlife. They simply refused to sanitize the violence of death with Greek philosophy. They knew the grave was an enemy that could only be defeated in one specific way, not by a ghost escaping a physical body, but by an event so impossibly violent it would changes how you read every single lament, every psalm, and every prophecy in the Old Testament. And when you realize what they were actually waiting for, you finally see why the ending of the story had to happen in a garden. A grieving patriarch holds a torn tunic and expects to meet his son in the dust. English translators sit in a damp room and divide an underworld that was meant to hold everyone. A mourning husband buys a limestone cave and seals a physical body in a physical grave. A dying musician writes the darkest song in the text and screams into the suffocating silence. A wise king watches the rich and the poor die and realizes the shadows swallow every human hierarchy. A drowning prophet sinks to the roots of the mountains, and a human prayer breaks the locks of the deep. A shepherd king looks at the vast night sky and realizes the presence of Yahweh is already waiting in the dark. Same silence, same grave. One God who refuses to leave us there. But here is the part I keep coming back to. The dirt, the damp, red clay of the Levant in Genesis chapter 2. Not a Greek philosophy trying to escape the body. Not a theology trying to fly away to the clouds. But a creator who bends down into the mud, gets his hands dirty, and breathes his own spirit into the dust to make us whole. The ancient Hebrews knew, because these ancient writers were not trying to give you a geography lesson of the afterlife. They were diagnosing the ultimate tragedy, the truth. We are not ghosts trapped in machines. We are bodies. And that means death is an absolute tragedy that demands a physical resurrection. If you are in a season where the silence feels absolute, where the darkness feels like it is swallowing everything you have built, or where death has taken someone you love and left you holding the torn pieces of what used to be, you do not have to. Pretend it is a beautiful promotion. You are allowed to hate the grave. You are allowed to weep in the dust, because you worship a God who does not ask you to escape your humanity. He stepped into it. He went down into Sheol himself, felt the cold stone of a borrowed kiver, and shattered the locked doors from the inside out. And may the God who is not afraid of the dark walk with you into yours and remind you that there is nowhere you can sink where his hand cannot reach you. If this shifted something in how you read the ancient text, subscribe and leave a comment. Even one word helps. Share this with someone who is grieving and needs to know they are allowed to just sit in the silence without having to sanitize it. Pray for us as we keep digging into these texts of the human condition, to feel the weight of what Jacob was actually saying, and to see how this one word radically alters. The afternoon sun is beating down on the encampment, but Jacob is shivering. His sons are standing around him, offering hollow words of comfort. The biblical story. You have to strip away everything you think you know about death. And to do that, you have to start with a massive collision of cultures. A collision that happened in a candlelit room in the year 1611, when a group of English scholars stared at this ancient Hebrew word and made a choice that permanently obscured the text. Picture a damp, stone room in Oxford in the early 1600s. 47 scholars bend over heavy oak tables. They are holding quill pens. They smell damp wool and fresh ink. They are staring at ancient Hebrew scrolls. They are tasked by King James to create a definitive English Bible. They read through the Old Testament. They hit a specific Hebrew word. It appears exactly 65 times. Sheol. They have a problem. The English language of 1611 does not have a word for what they are looking at. These scholars are brilliant men. But their imaginations are completely saturated in two things: Greek mythology and medieval theology. They know all about the Greek underworld of Hades. They know about Dante's rings of fire. They know about demons, eternal conscious torment, and a rigid, geographic separation between the righteous in the clouds. His daughters are weeping in the heat of the day, but Jacob refuses to be comforted. The text tells us he makes a vow, and the wicked in the flames. So they look at a single, unified Hebrew concept, and they shatter it 31 times. When the text associates the word with the wicked, they translate Sheol as hell 31 times. When the text associates the word with the righteous, they translate the exact same word as the grave 3 times. They translate it as the pit. The result is a linguistic catastrophe hiding in plain sight. An English reader opens their King James Bible and sees a stark cosmic division. They read about the wicked being cast into hell. They read about the righteous resting peacefully in the grave. They assume the Old Testament authors believed in a split-level afterlife, heaven above, hell below, but the Hebrew text makes no such division. The righteous and the wicked, the kings and the cowards, the prophets and the pagan armies, they are all heading to the exact same place. The 1611 translation is not a deliberate deception. It is a cultural projection. You cannot map a Greek underworld onto a Hebrew desert. When you impose European theology over ancient Near Eastern poetry, you lose the very thing the original authors were desperately trying to communicate. You lose the visceral horror, a dark promise spoken into the dry desert air. He declares that he will go down into the earth, mourning for his son. You lose the suffocating silence. You lose the ultimate tragedy that leveled every human being who ever walked the ancient earth. To find out what that tragedy actually looks like, you have to leave the candlelit rooms of Oxford. You have to rewind the clock 3,000 years. You have to walk back into the heat of the Canaanite desert, right up to the edge of a grieving father's tent. The hot wind blows through the oak trees of Mamre, carrying the sound of collective mourning. Jacob sits in the dirt, wearing rough goat hair sackcloth that scratches against his bare skin. He is holding the tunic of his favorite son. The linen fabric is stiff and dark with dried blood. His other sons and daughters stand at the edge of the tent, watching their patriarch shatter into pieces. They try to speak to him. They offer the customary words, the ancient rituals of comfort that the living always try to offer the devastated. The text tells us they rise up to comfort him, gathering around him in the suffocating heat of the afternoon. But Jacob refuses to hear it. He looks at the blood-stained fabric, and he speaks a vow into the heavy desert air. For I will go down to Sheol to my son. Mourning. Genesis chapter 37, verse 35. This is the very first time this word appears in the biblical narrative. But the place Jacob says he is going changes everything. He does not say he is going to be with God in the clouds. And the detail that should stop us in our tracks is exactly who is speaking it. This is Jacob. He is the man who slept on a stone and saw a staircase reaching into the divine realm. He is the man who wrestled with God in the mud until dawn and walked away with a limp. He is the bearer of the Abrahamic covenant, the patriarch whose very name will become the permanent identity of God's chosen people. If any human being in the ancient world has the right to expect a glorious, sunlit afterlife in the presence of the Creator, it is Jacob. But when the worst day of his life arrives, and his heart is completely broken, he does not look up into the sky. He looks down into the dust. He expects to reunite with his son, but he does not expect to do it in a place of light or joy. The destination he names is not a fiery torture chamber reserved for the wicked. It is the shadowy, inescapable abyss waiting for every single human being. When the English translators of 1611 arrived at this moment, they panicked. They looked at Jacob's words and realized they absolutely could not translate Sheol as hell here. It would completely shatter their European theology to put a righteous, covenant-bearing patriarch in a place of demonic torment. So in this specific verse, they changed their strategy. He does not say his son is waiting for him in a fiery underworld. He uses a word that echoes through the ancient text. They translated Sheol simply as the grave. They made it sound as if Jacob was just talking about a physical burial plot. They made it sound like he merely wanted his bones placed in the dirt. But the Hebrew language already has a perfectly good word for a physical hole dug in the earth. Jacob knew that word intimately. He had already used it years earlier when he buried his beloved wife Rachel by the side of the road to Bethlehem. But as he sits in the dust of Hebron, holding Joseph's ruined coat, he does not use the word for a physical tomb. He uses a word that describes an entirely different dimension. And to understand the absolute dread hiding inside his vow, you have to place these two ancient Hebrew words side by side. When the ancient Hebrews talked about digging a hole in the dirt, they used a very specific word. When Abraham purchased a cave to bury his wife Sarah, and the ancient Hebrew language is devastatingly precise. When a patriarchal family needed to bury a body in the ancient Near East, they did not dig a shallow, rectangular hole in the grass. They carved out a cave. You can hear the rhythmic scrape of bronze chisels striking hard limestone, like a heavy stone dropping into a deep well. He says he will go down to Sheol. You can smell the sharp scent of myrrh and aloe as the family wrapped the cold body in heavy linen strips. The Hebrew word for that physical, tangible tomb is kever. It appears dozens of times in the Old Testament. A kever is a specific geographic location. You can touch a kever. You can visit a kever. Abraham bought a kever with silver pieces in Genesis chapter 23 to bury his wife Sarah. But Jacob does not tell his surviving sons he is going down to a kever. He uses the Hebrew word Sheol. While a kever holds the physical bones, Sheol holds something else entirely. The exact etymology of the word is debated by scholars, but its root is deeply tied to the concept of a hollow, subterranean void, or a place of asking and inquiring. It is the cosmic realm of the dead. It is the shadowy underworld where the vibrant, breathing life of a human being fades into a colorless, whispering echo. If seeing the stark reality behind these ancient words is shifting how you read the Old Testament, you're exactly who this channel is for. Drop a thought in the comments and hit subscribe. Because every week we dig past the English translations into the raw text underneath. A grieving patriarch stares at the dirt and speaks that name. A righteous king named Hezekiah turns his face to a stone wall and weeps. So Jacob uses a word that changes the entire geography of his grief. Look at how the rest of the biblical authors fiercely separate these two concepts. You can eventually fill a kever with bodies, sealing it shut with a heavy, rolling stone so the wild animals cannot get in. But Proverbs chapter 27, verse 20 reveals a terrifying contrast. It says that Sheol is never satisfied. It is an insatiable, bottomless appetite holding its mouth open beneath the earth, swallowing generations of humanity without ever getting full. That linguistic distinction changes everything about how we read the ancient Hebrew afterlife. Sheol is not a physical graveyard you can measure with a ruler. It is the spiritual reality of utter depletion. It is the great, dark waiting room of the human soul. And to understand what the Israelites believed, it actually felt like to be trapped inside it. You have to turn to the darkest, most agonizing song in the entire biblical canon. A musician sits in a cold stone room, clutching a piece of coarse parchment. His body is failing. The air in the room is thick, heavy with the sharp smell of sickness and sweat. He is writing a song, but it is not a song of triumph. It is a scream reduced to a whisper. His name is Haman the Ezrahite, because he is being sent to its gates. A suffering man named Job scrapes his skin with broken pottery and actually begs God, and he is composing the words to Psalm 88. It is the darkest chapter in the entire biblical canon. Out of 150 psalms, it is the only one that ends without a single ray of hope, ending literally on the Hebrew word for darkness. And as Heman feels his breath slipping away, he describes the exact geography of the place he is sinking into. He calls it the realm of the dead. He calls it the deep. He calls it the place of ruin. But the most terrifying detail is what is missing. In the Hebrew mind, life is defined by breath, by praise, by memory, by the active presence of God. Life is the vibration of vocal chords singing in the temple courtyard. Life is the warmth of the sun on your skin. Life is covenant. Sheol is the absolute subtraction of all of it. Heman cries out into the shadows, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Are your wonders known in the darkness, or your righteous deeds in the land of forgetfulness? He is terrified because of the silence. In Sheol, the lips do not move. In Sheol, the lungs do not fill with air. In Sheol, the memory of God.